Welcome back to another Mixed Faith Marriage Mastermind. Tonight, we've got three mixed faith experts. And by experts, all three of us are coaches that work with people in the mixed faith space. And in addition to that, we are also in the trenches with you. We are in our own mixed faith marriages and families. So I'm Chris Rich. I am an active believing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. My husband and my three kids have no interest in religion at all. We've got Brooke Booth. Brooke is a post-Mormon and she is married to a believing spouse and has one child that attends. And Suzette is an active non-believing member and her husband is she's with a believing spouse. And then her kids are kind of figuring out where they're at. So we have a big variety in this group. So our goal of these mixed faith marriage masterminds is to just give you a ton of ideas with a variety of different viewpoints in hopes that you're going to be able to pick and choose from the things that we share and hopefully find some things that work for you and your relationships. And today we are going to be addressing something that I think all of us could use help with. I know I certainly can, and that is communication. And I saw a quote from George Bernard Shaw, and he said, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." I actually laughed out loud when I saw that because so often I know what I mean, but that doesn't mean that my husband or my kids or whoever I'm talking to. So communication is something that can definitely be tricky. So we have a bunch of different questions. And the first question that I want to ask is, let's get personal. Let's share from our own marriages. I want you to share a rose and a thorn. So a high and a low in your mixed faith marriage in regards to communication.
I can start, but
Yeah.
I would say it feels almost unfair because I would say we've had more highs than lows, and I know that's not typical, but it's only because I was well into training and working with couples, and so I was well immersed, very immersed in communication. So when I went through my own faith deconstruction, I was already kind of very practiced in using good communication skills. So it made all the difference. So it's been mostly good communication wise with my husband and I, but that does not mean we haven't had our moments where something happens and we just slip into reactivity, especially if it's like something the kids do, something that happens kind of in the moment. It's not like we've had time to think about it. That's when we tend to slip into kind of our lesser communication skills. So we still mess up, but overall we've had more roses than thorns. I know that is not normal. I'm grateful for it, but
So I can speak more to the thorns then. Happy to do that. So I was thinking about it and I was thinking, like, if you were like a fly on the wall, you'd be like, look, they're talking, they have lots to say. Like conversation, very easy to be had. Communication, though, I think is a little different than conversation. And I think sometimes we mix the two up a little bit. Like, if you look at simply at the amount of talking, then it looks good. But if you look at actually communicating, it's a different metric. So I just want to like paint that picture because like Rose, great conversations, maybe a thorn in the communication piece. And as I was thinking about that, like, what's the purpose of communication? Like conversation, you have conversations with all sorts of people, but what's the purpose of communication? And I was thinking, okay, it could be to work through things, to process things, to improve on things, to create safety and trust, to allow emotions to be shared. All of these things are reasons why we do communication. You can have the same conversation 400 times, but not be effective at communication. That would be the thorn I would describe. Is like we're really good at having the same conversation 400 times, but not hearing or understanding or bridging the gap.
So maybe it's like a fake flower, like a what's the word I'm looking for?
It's like silk.
A silk rose.
And I was thinking about it. I'm like, you can have 400 conversations where you just repeat patterns of defensiveness or deflection or projection, but are you building trust? Are you building safety? Are you exercising emotional connection?
Okay, as far as roses and thorns with us, we have a lot of both. I think one thing that is tricky, so my husband is not much of a talker, and I could talk all day long every day. In fact, I do. And so that's definitely tricky because we have very different styles of communication. Both of us are, I think there was a long time where we were very conflict avoidant. And so we just wouldn't talk about things. And that definitely made things hard. And I think there was a lot of times where it was just like feeling like roommates, where it's just, like we wouldn't bring things up. And luckily we've learned a lot since then, and we're learning and progressing. Um, as far as wins, I'm thankful to have some more wins. So that I love that you had those skills. I think that was what got me to be a coach, is because I didn't and I needed those skills. So interesting to look at at it from two different ways. As just a recent win that I can think of, the other day we were having a conversation and I noticed myself get very flooded, where it was just like I wasn't able to think or to listen. And I told him, I said, hey, I need to take a break for a minute because I am flooded. And I'll come back in about 20 minutes when I can think more clearly. And that was huge because it was like, okay, I can go calm down. And then I was able to, kind of figure out where I was. And then we came back and had a great conversation. And it felt like I was like, we just did that. It felt fantastic. So I love having those wins. Um, okay, so the next question, why can communication be so challenging?
I will say mostly it's because our brains are not wired for mature communication. That is one of the downsides of being mammals. We are wired like mammals. We are wired for survival, and survival does not care about other people's perspectives or empathy or consideration. So when we are activated, when we sense threat, when we feel intimidated, when we feel anxious, all of our wiring, our default programming that behind our communication is not skillful at all. So communication is so hard because we're not wired for it. The part of our brain that is really quick to assess information and then communicate from there, it's rapid fire fast, and it's all our protective strategies. It's fight, flight, freeze, fix. And the mature communication is much slower. It's like, whereas our primitive brain is less than 1/4 of a second, our mature communication skills take like 2 to 3 seconds to come online. So it takes an immense amount of self-awareness and maturity and self-control to communicate well. And I think that is the biggest factor, is our brains are not wired for it. And we have to learn to work with that, with our mammalian tendencies, our primitive tendencies, and this slow part of our brain that has better communication skills, like learning how to access that and kind of let that have the control. So our brains are the problem.
I really think about this along similar lines. So I was thinking about it in terms of like, there are so many different skills involved in communication. There's so many different qualities of communication. Like it's a big topic. It's like saying math, right? Like communication, like there's addition and subtraction and division and multiplication and fractions, and like it's a big topic. And I think it gets so challenging and overwhelming. Yeah, our brains are fighting us, but we're overwhelmed. We're overwhelmed at the skills to learn. We're overwhelmed at the whole, like what it really means and how to really become a person who communicate. Developing the skills, they're not easy. And then there's multiple skills. Like the whole process can be a little overwhelming, and that's helpful for me to recognize so I don't just give up because it's overwhelming, but I give myself permission to be overwhelmed and to accept that, and then to decide how I want to approach it. But I'm going to give 4 questions that I find helpful. Like if I'm recognizing that it's hard, but just some questions to help me, like, how to break it into parts so it's not so overwhelming. And so I'll ask myself things like, how are you sharing about your emotions and experience in this marriage? How is your spouse receiving your emotions and experience in this marriage? Just to start to break down the parts of communication. How is your spouse sharing their emotions and experience? How are you receiving your spouse's emotions and experience in the marriage? This doesn't cover all of communication, but it just starts to chunk it down so you can just focus on one thing at a time instead of the complete huge morass that is communication.
Those are great questions. So my thoughts are very similar to what Suzette, what you were saying, kind of a little bit of a different spin, but it has so much to do with our nervous systems, and our nervous systems are constantly scanning for safety and danger. Even before we start a conversation, they are looking for cues externally. They're looking at what's going on internally within us, and then relationally between the two of us. And our nervous system remembers all of those past conversations that we've had with everyone, and definitely with our spouse. Those times, because we all have times there where things didn't go well, and so our nervous system remembers that. So it's going to either assign us to a state of safety, and when we feel safe, then like Suzette was saying, that's where we're able to think and to listen. We're able to be curious and compassionate and articulate our thoughts. We can get things out when we feel safe. If we don't feel safe, and last time I was talking about how when we feel safe, we have our CEO on the part of our brain that I call the CEO, where we can think clearly. If we don't feel safe, and that reptilian brain that Suzette was talking about, or I call it your monkey brain, it goes into fight or flight or freeze, and then you have very little access to that CEO part of your brain. So you stop listening. You can't think. All those times you're like, I can't even think straight. Well, it's true. You can't because you don't have access to that part of your brain, and we get defensive and we get angry or we shut down. And then, so that's just happening for me. And then the person I'm talking to, that same thing. Their nervous systems are scanning for safety and danger all the time. So it's complex.
Can I have one more thought about
Yeah.
that I also thought about this question is it's like learning a language. If you're surrounded by it, like when you're a kid, you pick up that language really easily. So if you grow up in a home where there is very skilled communication, very mature communication, you grow up with that, you speak that language, you can do skilled communication. In our society, skilled communication is a newer thing generationally. Like this is something that wasn't known about, and maybe like our grandparents and great grandparents' generations. This is newer things that we're learning. And so with each generation, the more we can have skilled communication and our kids can grow up speaking that language of skilled communication, I think communication in general will be better, but we're just not there yet because it's not in every home, and it's not in our schools, and it's not in our systems and our culture yet. Skilled communication is not there. We're learning, but it's not there yet. So that's not the language that we grew up learning or that everyone around us grew up learning, but hopefully that will change.
Our lucky great grandchildren. Hopefully, right? Oh, okay. So my next question, what are some common communication pitfalls in mixed faith marriages, and how can they be avoided?
So I'll jump in with what I think is probably one of the most significant ones, and that's defensiveness. When you perceive an attack, maybe you are attacked, but it's often a perceived attack. You get uncomfortable, all of these things, you think you've done something wrong, so you become defensive. And a lot of times what's happening, and I'm not saying all the time, but a common situation is one partner is coming, wanting to share something that's important to them. I mean, we're not talking conversation, we're talking communication. They come wanting to discuss something. They may not say it perfectly, but it's important, and they're initiating a conversation, and then an attack is perceived. Maybe there's an actual attack, but I think a lot of the times it's perceived. And then defensiveness comes in. And what happens with that is now instead of validating or listening to them, you start picking a fight, really. You are not receptive to what they need to say. You're immediately protecting yourself You're immediately, denying, withdrawing, deflecting, whatever it may be. And now, with that said, this is the point I want to make, is you're taking their vulnerability and it's not being acknowledged. It's not being addressed. A lot of times when somebody becomes defensive, the person who initiated the conversation ends up apologizing. They end up being the person who's trying to make repairs or whatever. So I'll give you an example of how this can look. So let's say, this is from my real life, so I can just say, husband comes home, wife says, kids were hard today. And the husband might say, like, can we focus on the positive here? Tell me what went well. You always complain. Now, that may not sound like an attack. I perceived it that way. And so I came with something vulnerable instead of him validating, listening, understanding. Like, he didn't want to hear about negative things. He only wanted to hear about positive things. And so I would back off and be like, you're right, I'm complaining, I'm sorry. And then I maybe share like a funny story about the kids at the park or something. And the result is, like, there was no space for me to have negative emotions. I think I've even shared this in the past, but it's so on point with this topic. Like, there was no space for negative emotions. They're not interested, they're not important, you can't talk about them. I only want to see the part of you that I can deal with and be comfortable and doesn't trigger my defensiveness. I only want to see that part. And so the conversations and the communication becomes less and less and less. Like, this is where communication starts to be less and less and less, because if you come with something vulnerable and it's met with defensiveness, you're not going to want to do that over and over and over and over again. You're going to bring up things less and less and less and less. So then you put that in a mixed faith marriage, right? Like, you're not even going to bring it up. Like, if you can't talk about having a hard day with the kids, are you going to talk about Joseph Smith issues or tithing issues? Like, it's such a loaded question. It's such a no-go zone. It's so off topic that it becomes incredibly hard. So when I think about like problems with, what did you call it? Common communication pitfalls. I would say it's those things that make it harder to communicate the next time because there was no safety, and defensiveness is probably one of the primary things.
I definitely agree with that. What came to my mind is the movie Home, like the kids' cartoon movie Home, and there's the king of the boofs, and he's talking about one of the mistakes, and he says there was many mistakes. And that's what I thought about this. Like the mistakes, the pitfalls that we make in communication in mixed faith marriages, like there's so many. And again, this is not because people aren't intelligent or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. Again, it's just the way we're wired and lack of education and modeling and things like that. But if I had to kind of categorize some of the biggest pitfalls, I would say one is getting into objectivity battles. Whose perspective is right? My perspective is right, yours is wrong. Trying to prove your perspective, whose objective reality is the right reality, is one of the biggest pitfalls I see. So that's the first thing. The second thing is bringing in sources to prove yourself and your way of thinking. But listen to this podcast, read this book, read this article. And if you'll just do that, then you can see. So bringing in external resources to validate is just an invitation for the other person to counter. It's a mess. It's not going to go anywhere. And then the third is pitfall is not being contained enough. Communication requires a ton of restraint and lack of restraint. And a lot of people feel like, well, you're my spouse. You should be my best friend. I should be able to tell you anything that's on my mind. No, the stakes are high in your marriage. You can't just say what's on your mind. You have to really be careful about how you say it, what you say. There's a lot of filtering. And so lack of containment, not enough restraint and filtering, and just saying whatever's on your mind, whatever you really think. No, it's not a good idea. So objective reality battles, trying to prove your point with external resources, and lack of restraint is kind of my biggest three that I see in couples that I work with.
I wanted to add to what Brooke was saying with defensiveness. I love the quote from Byron Katie: defense is the first act of war. And when I notice myself getting defensive, that's the thought that comes to me. And it's like, okay, do I want to go to battle right now? Because I'm ready with my dukes up and my shield and my sword. Or is this something where it's like, no, this isn't something I can let the shield down, but I think that can be helpful. And there are times where you do want to go to you have to ask yourself, do I want to go to war about this? A couple of the pitfalls that I thought about, black and white thinking, I think can definitely be something. So often we use absolutes like you always or you never. And that is a great way to get your monkey on board, where it's just like you want to protect yourself and you go into fight or flight. And so instead of that, maybe instead of you never listened to me, something like I felt unheard during our conversation today. So using an I coming from how you feel instead of you. I statements can be a lot better than you statements. We like to jump to conclusions. All of us, we turn into mind readers and fortune tellers. So our spouse might say something and we assume that we know their thoughts and their feelings and their future actions when we don't. Instead of doing that, we want to be more curious and ask open questions, like, can you help me understand your perspective? So that can be helpful. And then the other pitfall that I thought of, we magnify things and catastrophize things. We go to the worst. Our brains are designed to look for problems. And so we go to the worst case scenario. So if they don't come to church with me, our children will lose their faith and their chance at eternal salvation. Like all of a sudden, it's like, we climb on this train that takes us to the destination of the worst case scenario. Or, if we don't agree on tithing, our finances are going to be ruined and we're never going to have a peaceful life. So we can turn it into a catastrophe. So, and those are some of the pitfalls that I see. Okay. So our next question, how can couples navigate conversations about deeply held beliefs without creating unnecessary conflict?
I will start with this one. I'm going to use the imagery of like bowling and the gutters. And you know how when kids bowl, they can put the little guards up so they don't go in the gutters. I think whenever you're communicating, you need to do some things to kind of make sure you don't go in the gutters, right? The unnecessary conflict. So some of those things are having a purpose in mind. Don't just start talking if you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, right? You need to like, am I looking for a compromise? Am I looking for a solution? Am I wanting to just feel heard and understood? Why am I talking? That's the number one thing. Why am I talking? So people who are external processors tend to get in the gutters more often because they just love to talk and they might, say stuff and then the other person gets defensive and then they bring in 10 million other things because their thoughts are going a million miles an hour because they don't really have a goal. So external processors tend to struggle a little bit more with this, but having a goal, why am I talking, really can keep you out of the gutters so that you can actually get somewhere productive with your conversation. Also think about how you start the conversation is how it's going to end. If you are starting with facts and trying to prove your point, all you're doing is inviting the other person to do the same. And it's just going to be an escalation of trying to prove your point. If you're starting with complaints, you're just inviting the other person to defend against your complaints or tell you why you're wrong, right? So that's another way to keep yourself out of the gutters. However I start this is what I'm going to get back. So if you're starting with, well, Joseph Smith did this and read this, you're just inviting the other person to counter that. Well, what about this? And what about, so just think about what are you starting with and why am I talking? And I will talk about this more with some of your other questions, but you just stick to your subjective reality. I'm feeling this. Here's what's going on within me. That's vulnerability. If you lead with vulnerability, it invites vulnerability in return.
So important what Suzette's saying is like have a plan, make a goal for the conversation. We get sidetracked so easily. Point I wanted to make was entirely different though, and that is like I was really interested in how this question was phrased. How can couples navigate conversations about deeply held beliefs without creating unnecessary conflict? I was really interested in the phrase unnecessary conflict because I think a lot of times in our effort to avoid navigating conversations like this and in our effort to avoid quote unquote unnecessary conflict, we're missing out on some things. Like I would even question unnecessary conflict. Like, what are we talking about here? Like, what does that mean? Like, I get like ugly name calling. Yeah, let's avoid that. But I think sometimes in an effort to avoid like the super ugly stuff, we don't actually engage in communication as often as we are. We're just too shy or scared, and we pull back too much from conversation. It's like conflict in and of itself is an important part of a marriage. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not a moral failing on anybody's part. It's absolutely going to happen when two people live together, let alone when they have different religious beliefs. So when we talk about like avoiding conflict, that's kind of like saying I want to go scuba diving but not get in the ocean. Like, not sure that's really available. So maybe the question is like, what if you didn't try to avoid conflict? Again, taking out the nasties. I'm not saying you go and you just start attacking people. We're not doing that. But what if you weren't trying to avoid conflict? Like, what do you make it mean if there is conflict in your marriage? A lot of people make it mean they're a failure or they're mean or things like this. What if you could face the conflict, you know, the challenge, if you will, with curiosity, with openness, wanting to work together to process through it, to explore it, to understand it. But oftentimes we don't even get there. We don't even get to go there and practice skills because we're so carefully avoiding conflict.
And that's very similar to what I was thinking about too, that conflict. So I used to avoid conflict like the plague. It was just like it seems so scary. And conflict is actually a healthy thing. And exactly like Brooke was saying, like, you know, we want to be kind to each other, but it's totally okay to have two different opinions because you're two different people. Of course, we're going to have different opinions on things. And I think this idea that we should be on the same page, that I think that can be very tricky. Says who? Why do we need to be on the same page? I mean, it can make things easier at times, but when I think that something to really question. Also, I learned that I spent a lot of time avoiding conflict. So I would avoid external conflict, but then I was internally conflicted because I wasn't saying what I wanted to say. So there's going to be conflict either way. You're either going to have external or internal. So it's important to pick the conflict that is going to help you to grow as who you want to be, the person you want to be, and also what do you want to have happen in your marriage. So I think it's important to look at those. Okay, my next question, what strategies can help partners truly listen to each other, even when they fundamentally disagree?
I'll name some of my favorite strategies. First is be concise. Again, have your goal in mind, know exactly what you're aiming for, and name that out front. I want to have a conversation about this. Put a time limit on it for 10 minutes, for 15 minutes. My goal is for us to come to find some middle ground or to make a decision about this or whatever. So concise and to the point. The more you veer from your goal, the more you are opening yourself up to fall into the gutters of communication and have it go off rails. Some other strategies are, it's less of a strategy, it's more just like I don't know. Just don't expect your partner to be your safe space to process all of your pain around this, all of your grief. It's an unreasonable expectation. If you think your partner is going to be the one that you can process your grief around your faith deconstruction, or if you're the believing spouse, if you think your partner can be the one to help you process the grief around losing your spouse not being a member of the church, that is an unreasonable expectation. You need to do that with a therapist, with a friend, because both people are grieving, and you can't expect somebody who's grieving to make space for your grief in the way that will feel good to you, because it's going to be so activating to their own grief and their own sensitivities. So I would say just be really aware of what you're expecting of your spouse. Like, it would take such maturity, like more maturity than I have. If my spouse expected me to be the person he could like process all of his grief and angst about my faith deconstruction, that's too personal for me. I could handle it a little bit. I've got skills, but like I couldn't do that for very long before I would start to get really like too defensive and things. So I think that's just a general rule. Like, they can't be the one. They can't, and that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow, that your spouse cannot be the one that you can talk to about all of your pain around the mixed faith marriage. And other strategies, focus on your own side of the street, commit to being respectful no matter what, even if your spouse starts to be condescending, or, or they lose their temper, they raise their voice, you commit to being respectful. If you need to leave the room, that's fine. Don't engage in disrespectful conversation. Like, don't listen to it, leave the room, and don't speak it. Don't be condescending. Never fall below respect to your spouse, ever, ever. Like, make that your personal commitment. No matter what the other person does, you stay respectful. You don't get contemptuous. You don't get condescending, no matter how hard it is to do. So those are my strategies.
Those are great. I got to be taking notes. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this a couple times myself. Suzette, you said something that made, like expecting your person to always be the one that you should be able to go to. I heard a great quote, and that was, "Don't go to the hardware store to buy milk, because they don't sell milk. So let's not go to Home Depot to grab that gallon of milk. We can go to other people that can help us with that. And a lot of times we just keep going to Home Depot and they never have milk, ever." Um, okay, so a couple of things that I thought of is giving up the need to be right. We all want to be right, and on most things, and a lot of things with faith, we can't prove it. I can't prove that God is real, and you can't prove that he's not. So giving up that need to be right I think that can be a big thing. I don't need to change how I believe about that, but I don't need to continually bring that to the conversation that I have to be right. Although we all think we are. Just want to throw that out there. Also, I like to ask myself the question, am I communicating to convince someone, or am I communicating to understand them? Because sometimes it's just, we're trying to pull them on our side, and because we think we're right. And to, to really try to listen to understand them, and to be, to ask questions and to understand where they're at, instead of trying to pull them over to the other side that I have in air quotes. Okay, how can couples create a safe space?
Did we hear Brooks? Did we hear Brooks' strategies? I just don't want to.
I just cut you right off, Brooke.
I'm cool either way, but I'll share my strategies. I think a lot of this is you got to do some work on you. You got to figure out what your triggers are. I mean, if you just expect that you're going to be a safe space, no. Or if you just want to be a safe space, you want to be a safe person, it's not the same as being a safe person. I've worked with lots and lots of individuals who want to be a safe person, but it's very different than developing the skills of being a safe person for their spouse. And one of the primary skills is working on your triggers, knowing why you get defensive, and then being able to work through that, create new skills, new pathways, like neural pathways around that, so you can show up differently. What triggers your defensiveness, your passiveness, your fears, whatever it is that compromises you being a safe person, and really going into that internal audit, if you will, and then making the changes necessary. The biggest thing I think that stops us from being a safe person is thinking we are, and we're not.
Okay. How can couples create a safe space for open and honest communication about faith, values, and expectations?
I think just sharing about your inner experience, internal dilemmas, your internal battles is the way to go. It's not going to be a safe space to share about things if you're kind of, I think people wade too deep sometimes in a communication, and they're like trying to explain all the things. Well, this is the reason I think this is because Joseph Smith did this and the blah blah blah, and they are going too deep in, instead of just sticking to, here's an example. Maybe they would say, I've learned things about church finances, and now I'm really struggling with the idea of paying tithing. That's super short and simple. Concise, short, and simple is more manageable for the other person. And we're not bringing in a ton of facts. We're just sharing, like, here's my internal battle that I'm fighting. I learned some things and now I don't know what to do, right? Or it could be like, I'm really struggling as our kids are entering young women's because I had some of my own experiences that have kind of traumatized me. And so I'm really battling with how to deal with our kids being that age. And it can be vice versa. Like for the believing spouse, they might say, I really want to have scripture study as a family, but I know you don't believe, and I'm really struggling with how to find something that will work for both of us. And I'm worried about like overstepping my boundaries if I read scriptures with the kids. So you just don't bring in all the extra crap. I think mixed faith couples they're like living in all this extra crap and like, you don't need it. Just get rid of all that. Keep it really short, concise about your internal battle, your internal struggle in like 2 sentences. That makes it really safe and for the other person to know what you're looking for and to be able to hear it because it's not cluttered with all this extra crap in the way. So that's my thought.
That's fascinating because I was thinking about it in like the other side, but the exact same point. And that's like really wanting to know and understand your partner's experience, like in life, in the marriage, in their faith, in their like really wanting to understand. That doesn't mean you agree with it or you like it, but like really genuinely wanting to understand, even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it challenges your stuff and you. Like just having that, like, I care, I want to know, and I can handle the discomfort because I want to know about you. That's a lovely container to create.
Going back to talking about the monkey brain that I love to talk about. If you know you're in monkey mode, don't have a conversation when you're in monkey mode. That is an important thing to pay attention to. And sometimes I'll be like, okay, I'm in monkey mode, but I still think it would be a good idea. It's never a good idea. So to take a good deep breath, to take a 20-minute break, go on a run, sleep on it. I remember people used to say, don't go to bed angry. I think that's terrible advice. If you are tired, it's going to push you more into monkey mode. So sleep on it, come back to the conversation. That can create more safety. And then just like the simple things, like to be present, put your phone down, close your laptop, make eye contact, those little things to show that you are, that you're listening. Maybe, putting a hand on their shoulder or, just to show that you're present and there. Okay. We've so many great tips. I love all these. I want to go back. I wish I could have you guys in my ear as like okay, you should say this now. Can we do that?
We all need that.
Just
We
go
all need
back and
that.
listen to these podcasts and you're wearing your ear as much as you want, Chris.
That's true. That's a good point. Okay, anything else that you want to add to the conversation?
I'll add one last thing, and that is, we didn't even talk about many facets of communication. Probably for a good idea, because then everybody would get overwhelmed, you'd get overwhelmed, we'd all be overwhelmed. But I would say just take one thing. Just take one thing you want to work on in communication. And that's the only thing you need to worry about for now. Don't worry about being perfect in all the areas. Like if you want to start with creating a safe space, do that. If you want to start with listening, do that. If you want to start with sharing your own emotions, do that. Like if you want to start with just working on your own defensiveness or your own triggers, like do that. Like just pick one thing. And I love what Suzette was saying earlier. Like just learn like few vocabulary words. We don't need to learn all the syntax and all the vocabulary words in one day. This is a totally new language in many regards. And just learn one thing at a time. And as you practice it, then you move on to the next, and you practice it and move on to the next, and practice it and move on to the next. Pretty soon you'll have a pretty good skill set. You may not be fluent. That's okay. Like it takes time. This isn't one of those things where you need to rush. I know it feels like sometimes our relationships are tenuous and we need to rush and learn these things, but you just can't. You can only take it at the pace you can. That's okay.
And my final thoughts would be, don't get bogged down. I think mixed faith couples get so bogged down in trying to understand each other's perspectives and sharing their perspective and sharing their whys. And I think baseline, just start with the understanding that they're never going to understand you, and that's okay. They're never going to see things from your point of view. They're going to have their own thoughts about your faith deconstruction or you're staying in the church or whatever. You're not going to change that. So just let all that go and start with, okay, where do we go from here? We believe differently. How should we handle this? How do we want to move forward about this? Most of my husband's and I discussions, like I never talk about my reasons for believing. That's one of our roses. Is when I first went through my faith deconstruction, I said, do you want to hear any of my reasons? And he said, no, not really. And I said, okay, great. So since then, I've never really told him any like reasons why I believe the way that I do. That's not what we spend our time on. It's more like the day-to-day logistical stuff. Like over Christmas, we didn't do the nativity mostly because we have teenagers. And so I asked him, I was like, are you okay with us not having as much religious components to our holiday celebration? Do you want more? Were you okay that we didn't do the nativity? It's just more logistical day-to-day stuff like that is what we have conversations about. And I feel like just don't get bogged down with all the trying to explain and convince. It's like, we see things differently. How are we going to do this? How do you want to do this? What do you think about this? Much more practical. Just stay in the practical. That's another way to keep yourself from getting into the gutters of communication, because it's so easy to get in the gutters in mixed faith marriage conversations if you don't have good skills.
I took a bowling class once and I ended up throwing the bowling ball behind me. I think I even had gutters and the bowling ball ended up going behind me. So you gotta think of those ones too. But I was just thinking with Suzette, what you were saying. My mom would always, she had this little quote: "A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." And yeah, we're going to have different opinions, and arguing about it probably is not going to change their opinion. So, the other piece of advice, I just read a fantastic book by the Gottmans called Fight Right. And I highlighted the entire thing. It was so good. So many good little tips. A lot of the things that we've shared, they mentioned in that book. But if you're looking for a good read, go read Fight Right. It's a great one. Well, my friends, another great mixed faith marriage mastermind. Thank you. And I can't wait to see what we come up with next month. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you next month.